Hey, I'm Jim Christy. I'm the CEO at Postali.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah, so Postali, obviously, digital marketing agency specifically for lawyers, and I think people have probably heard, ads and all that stuff on our podcast and all that stuff. But so I appreciate you being here talking with us. And what we're talking about, as you can imagine, websites. Um, so when I think of building my website, the first things that come into my mind are obviously, okay, well, how am I going to get that copy? How am I going to get all the images? What is it going to look like? What color am I going to use and all that? But you and I were talking, there's a lot more to think about even before you get started that people don't really grasp, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a couple of things that it seems like somebody who's building a site for the first time or even rebuilding a site, it's just natural to want to jump over. Either one, because maybe they're a little bit boring, or two, they haven't gone through the process and they haven't felt the pain of not doing certain things, right?
Right.
So one of them that I think we've actually talked about before is branding. So
Mm-hmm.
just like getting the messaging down so that it's a lot easier to understand how you should be articulating things going forward. So not talking about that today, though.
Mm-hmm.
The next piece, and these are actually kind of sequential in the order of like,
Okay.
we want people to think about their brand first, and then after that, we want them to be thinking about the architecture of their website. So, what does that mean? It
Mm-hmm.
actually means a lot. It means not just how is the website going to be built, but how's it going to scale? What content's going to be on there? So you have like a keyword research, content planning element into
Mm-hmm.
it. And then the architecture is really visualizing it. So who's ever working on the site with you really has a clear understanding of how things fit together, how they grow, and you can, move some things around without having to build the site and then go, oh no, I that shouldn't go there, and then it's built and you have to move it around. You can build it, like frame it up before you build it so that you can build it and kind of know what you're getting.
So what's the, I guess, kind of what's the importance of not wanting to move it around after the fact? Because we think about lawyers a lot of times talks about being agile, like move fast, break things and change it, test it and all that
Yeah.
stuff. So what's the importance of getting it, at least this, right, kind of the first time?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely financial consideration there.
Hmm.
The more you break your website, the more it's going to cost you in time or money to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, that's kind of like a
Yeah.
brass tacks what it is. But
Yeah.
but I think the other piece is that you can run into a lot of technical problems. So when you think
Okay.
about what a website is constructed of, it's URLs, right? You get your domain, and then all of your content lives on these URLs that have a relationship to one another.
Hmm.
So, and that relationship kind of all stems from your homepage. So, like, we're going to talk today about a family law firm website, but that homepage is centered around family law, and then you have subtopics that associate, kind of hierarchical down. If you don't think about that structure ahead of time, you end up creating URLs that might not make sense. And then maybe down the road, you have to either redirect them or they break, or you may wonder, why am I not ranking in search for certain things? And it could have a lot to do with like just the way your site is built. So we actually run into a lot of problems or a lot of instances where people come to us, they've built a site on their own, and we have to say, I'm sorry, but the way that this is constructed, we can't do anything with it other than completely rebuild it
Hmm.
because we're gonna have to change so much that we're building the car again. Like, don't make us take all the parts apart and then, we're just
Right.
building a new car. We can't put it back together.
So is that what I'm kind of grabbing from here is that that's from an SEO perspective, like Google or Bing or whatnot are expecting these sites to have some sort of logical structure. Is that kind of what we're talking about? Why having it be willy-nilly is bad? Because when I think about it, I think, well, Google knows everything. They know how to get to this portion, but that's not the case. They need
Yeah.
to be structured a little better.
Yeah, and I definitely don't want to think too much about Google. I mean, you are right, but I don't want to think too much about Google and not enough about a user, because
Okay. Okay.
the way that Google is trying to understand a website is very similar to how a user would.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see navigational elements and you decide to follow them based on what feels intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
And Google now, a user isn't going to click every single link on a website the way that Google does
Right.
to try to map that out and create this like model of what it physically would be.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're not investing in SEO, you want your website to be friendly and accessible, and you want people to go to it and go, oh, there's a clear button, like I can click on that and I know where I'm going to go. We always
Mm-hmm.
there's a great book called Don't Make Me Think. I think there's a follow-up to it that's like Rocket Surgery Made
Rocket
Simple or
surgery
something
made
like
easy.
that. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and they use the analogy of like walking into a department store.
Mm-hmm.
This is like an analog way of thinking about it, that if you walk in and you have signs high above that you can kind of understand, oh, this is the produce section, or
Mm-hmm.
this is the butcher. Even if you've never been there, those are really great reference points. And thinking about your website the same way, like I'm always very surprised by sites that aren't planned out ahead of times. It follows like one person's train of thought, and it doesn't think about how a collective user group would understand something. You really have to distill it down to the simplest thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes if you're building a site on your own, especially, you're just using your own thoughts, and that can be problematic when you get into, especially people that don't understand the law. They
Mm-hmm.
don't know relationships between certain practice areas, so they don't know how to follow that. It needs to really be like built for somebody who's a novice
Mm-hmm.
in like completely.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. So if I were trying to imagine this, if I'm haven't built a site before, what does this look like? Do you have kind of an example, or can show us kind of where we're going here?
Yeah, so glad you asked, Zach. Yeah, we have an example.
I had no
Yeah.
idea. I had no idea.
Oh, well, yeah, it's just right here in my pocket. Yes. So today we are going to walk through a sample. So what we're going to look at today, we at Postali, we use a tool called Miro.
Mm-hmm.
There's a free version of this. So what I'm showing you today you can sign up for free. You can build this on your own. There are a lot of ways to do this. Some people just use Microsoft Word and have little boxes, because what we're really doing is we're doing a two-dimensional architecture, something flat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the capabilities here, we'll see, we get a little more depth, and we'll talk about why this particular planning component can be a really lengthy process, and it really should be.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other thing I really want to stress in this session, is that it's you can do anything in life, right, at a very cursory level or really in depth.
Right.
So if you're just building a website for the first time and you know you're going to have 3 or 4 pages and you don't want to go into the depth that we talked about today, that's probably okay. But today we're talking about somebody who wants to create a website that's going to compete,
Mm-hmm.
going to compete from an SEO perspective, be found, have enough content to be worthwhile, and like can make sense of a lot of content architecturally. So
Right.
this tool isn't for everybody, but you can slim it down to suit your needs.
Okay. And
So
as we've kind
yeah,
of
so
said
let me,
before, your website now for a lawyer isn't just a billboard kind of shining in the darkness. It has to almost be active
right.
in advertising itself with SEO, SERP, all that stuff.
And even if you're only trying to compete for your own branded terms, I mean,
Right.
sometimes that alone can be challenging. So yeah, so to kind of kick off here, what you're seeing right now is kind of a zoomed out version of a flat architecture
Mm-hmm.
of a website. There are a lot of lines connecting things. That I'll explain all this, so don't get overwhelmed by like what seems like complex items that really aren't. But
Mm-hmm.
start with the homepage. Everybody has a homepage, and it's very essential. And a lot goes into planning a homepage and we'll talk about all the components of an individual page, and then thinking about doing this at every new page that you add to your site.
Okay.
So here we have a domain, right? So you have to have a domain. Your homepage is always just going to be nothing after the slash, no folders or anything like that. And I'll expand this out. So when we do this, everything has a lot of complexity to it. We open these up, and this gives details around what is this page really all about.
Okay.
So we've got our start with the domain. This is even a question we get a lot of: how do I choose my domain? This personally, I don't think this matters as much anymore as it used to from an SEO perspective, but it is always good to think about finding something memorable or trying to find something that is, depending on your goals, maybe like you can think about a succession plan. So maybe don't use your name in the domain. Try to find something that's a little bit more transferable. So you need a domain. The next thing is, what are you going to title this particular web page? So a title from an SEO perspective is kind of telling Google what it's about, or from a user's perspective, it's telling the user what to expect on the page. So in this case, this happens to be, we're doing a Georgia sample here. So they're in Marietta, Georgia, family lawyer. This is what the whole website's about: family law in Marietta, Georgia. There's a little county element and then a name. So this is, even from the page by page planning, you want to think about, what's this really about? Theme it out first.
Okay.
So all that makes sense so far?
Yeah. And just to kind of clarify this title, that's kind of that thing that when you hover over the tab, it comes up and you can see what the page is about. That's where I run across the titles a lot of time in everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're not in SEO all the time, that's where you would see it. You might also see it as like the literal header text that you see, depending on how the site is built. So other things to think about are timing of a page. So for us, we have to think about, are we writing this content immediately, or is this content that's getting planned at some point down the road? There might be 100 pages that could be written or more about family law. You're not going to write them all at once. So making a decision about, when you launch your website, how much do you really need? Is it 5 pages? Is it 10? So we want to think about, how important is this? So a homepage is essential. You have to have it. It needs to be at the launch of the website. It is essential. Another thing to think about is, what's the intent of this page? And thinking about this for all your pages as you plan them out. Like, we tend to think about 3 categories: transactional, informational, navigational. Transactional means it should compel somebody to take an action. So most of the copy is a little bit more sales focused than deep, like legally dense content. That's an informational page. Legally dense content where people are answering, you're giving legal information, not advice, but information, and in a more robust form. And then navigational is purely just to get somebody else. It's almost like hey, I know you're trying to find something. Here's just a launch point for you to go in the right direction.
Okay.
Cool. The other things to think about here are, and I won't spend a ton of time on this. This is more SEO focused, but what terms do you actually want to try to compete for rankings on this page? So in this case, there might be a couple primaries, a few additional, and then some that are just related. The element here that we're really talking about that kind of goes undone with a lot of, we'll use an example. Like, if you're calling around to get quotes for a website, for example, and you say, how much does it cost to build a site? More often than not, unless you're specifically asking for this, you're not going to get a deep level of keyword research in your planning. And this is very time consuming. So when you're kind of comparing quotes, or whether you're trying to do this on your own, thinking about how much research and effort you want to put into actually ranking your website. And if it's a lot, asking questions about what type of planning goes into every page is super important, because you might be paying just as much for somebody that's not doing this work. And that can be a detriment to them over the long run. Those are things to think about on every page. So the next step is then, okay, the homepage is easy. We know where that goes. It's on the domain, like the root domain. There's nothing else to really like plan for there. But then we have to think about, what other types of navigation points are the most important for your potential client. Now, the nice thing about this is that this can be a little bit formulaic. Most people want the same types of things. It just needs to be catered a little bit to your audience. So in this
Mm-hmm.
case, we have an about section. Everybody wants to know about you, about the lawyers, about the firm's values. So it's not unusual to see an about drop down.
Right.
So in this map, we're just saying this is a drop down item that has an about page. So
Mm-hmm.
when we open it up, /about, that goes at the end of that domain. So we're planning what is the actual URL going to be
Okay.
that we build this type of page around. So um, so then we have to start thinking about nesting. Okay, what's logically going to go under an about page? And
Mm-hmm.
more often than not, it's just going to be attorney bios, individual bios. Now, if you're the only attorney in your firm, you may not need your own individual bio. You may be the only one there, and it's actually one and the same. Your about
Mm-hmm.
page is your bio page.
Mm-hmm.
I would question the scalability of that. We've had situations where you build that way, and then somebody says, "Oh, I have a partner now. Do you need to then add a new page for the partner and probably for yourself where it's confusing?"
Okay, so that actually I think is a good example of kind of problematic initial structure. If you have an
Mhm.
about page that has, let's just say me, I have an about page and it's just got me because I'm the only person, but then I've got that page linked to my LinkedIn. I've got that linked to somewhere on Facebook. I've got it linked to articles that I've written because that's where I want people to go. And now I get a partner and I break off my section of that page into /Zach Glazer. Well, now all those links, we have to think about what to do with them. Because do we want them to go to that about page because that's where it still is and that's the URL they're linked to, or do we want them to go to my page? Well, now we've got to redirect it. When we just get into some really tricky stuff if you don't think about that on the front end.
Yeah, that is a great point. I mean, and that is something that we run into a lot with like true solos who are starting out on their very, very first website.
Mm-hmm.
And we run into the same type of problem with practice area expansion,
Right.
where they think that they may only do one kind of siloed type of practice area, and then they haven't built any flexibility into adding more, and that
Mm-hmm.
becomes problematic. That usually becomes problematic at the homepage level, where if your whole
Right.
homepage is about I'm a family lawyer, and then you bring in a partner that does criminal defense, suddenly you have to think about, oh no, what does that do? Now my whole image and theme is family law.
Mm-hmm.
So these things happen. Like sometimes just you can't plan the future. You
Right.
don't know what to expect. There are ways to solve these things, but like if you know in 9 months that you are likely going to expand practice areas, that's a whole different conversation than like I'm going to do family law for the next 5 years unless something catastrophic happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, very very good point there. Um, and that's kind of talking about the practice areas that segues into the next piece, which is like, what do you actually want to focus on? And not just from, you know, very much focus on like, what do you want to focus on as a lawyer? And then
Mm-hmm.
how do you want that to be communicated to your potential clients?
Right.
So for example, you could choose to just as easily have a menu that says practice areas
Sure.
versus in this particular case, we have a menu that has divorce is one primary and children in custody is another.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say, we really kind of think about our firm in two ways, we handle X and we handle Y, like make it really easy for your audience to recognize that without having to think too much about it.
Mm-hmm.
Even the term practice areas can kind of be a little bit strange to people that don't interact with law all the
Right.
time.
Right.
So just small things like that. Um, Here's another kind of, diving deeper into this. We're getting into some of the actual like areas of practice based pages, divorce, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll notice here, like we actually have a couple pages nested. These lines kind of represent this nested relationship where divorce lawyer is the primary folder
Mm-hmm.
theme, if you will. And then we're going to talk about high asset divorce. And then we're going to talk about business ownership as a subcategory of high asset divorce. And I think one of the things to think about here is could we talk about all of these things on one page?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And this is a question we get a lot. Like, how do I really know how to break this down? Is it one page? Is it 3 pages? Is it 5 pages? And I think one of the areas that, like, the thing that we try to get people to come back to is like, if the advice that you're going to give your client is dramatically different in some of these areas, or you feel like you have enough to say that it really pulls it apart into its own area, it probably needs to be its own URL.
Mm-hmm.
Or if the search volume, this is more from a technical side, if the search volume warrants it. So an agency would be able to help guide you on that. But
Mm-hmm.
if, for example, if you would have a very different conversation with somebody who's a high asset business owner going through a divorce than you would kind of a lay person who has very like a pedestrian level of assets or kind of the normal things that you would see, you can probably just have a little blurb there on this page about high asset and don't worry about it. But if it's something you really want to focus on, you have a lot to say about it, definitely pull it into its own page.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes down to kind of what you were saying. If you know that you're going to do this eventually, planning for it now, even if you don't want to write this page today, if you say, high asset divorce is important, I want to at least get my groundwork set up first, but I know that high asset and business ownership divorce are things I want to go to, then you can write this content in a much broader way, knowing that you don't have to get into details about these subpages because you're going to get into them then. So it helps you outline your content well ahead of time so that you're not, writing 4,000 words here and then going, oh man, I actually have to break that up now that I want to expand these out. And then you have the same situation where you've got links pointing in the wrong place and all of that. So
Mm-hmm. I like that from a standpoint of, kind of planning it out, knowing that I'm going to get to writing this, because I think a lot of attorneys, you look at this and I think I have to put so much effort into creating the copy because that is the majority of the stuff that I can do, but, and so if I put too much effort into the architecture, well, then I'm not going to have time to build all this stuff. Well, you don't have to build all this stuff just for launch. You can plan it,
right.
but you don't have to write that high asset business ownership section right at launch, but it's good to know it's going to be there.
Yeah. It will save you a ton of time. And all of these things can be done in just a Word document too. Like, even if you don't want to do it in this like very visual way, we do this as a way to communicate what we're recommending to our clients in a way that's kind of clear to understand visually. But like, if you're doing this on your own, you can do a Word document outline and say anything that's below like a Roman numeral is going to get its own page, or, things like that. I think the important part to take away is like, do the planning work, because otherwise you're going to end up redoing a lot of work down the road. And it hurts. It's painful to have to go back and tread that ground again. And just kind of quickly here, a couple other things that, we do tend to see that people overlook, like showcasing results or testimonials in a navigation item is a thing that's commonly overlooked. Just people want to hear social proof of what have you done? Like, what have you achieved for your clients? So that's another thing to really make sure that you focus on. Results are both testimonials and actual case results, where you're writing up a little bit about success that you've achieved for your clients.
Okay.
Yep. One other thing, I mean, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think there are some layouts here that may seem a little bit confusing to, folks who haven't done this before. And I think that what we're saying here with some of these linear relationships and the arrows and everything is that what we really want the user to be able to do. So from this page, for example, if child custody and lawyers, what we would call a parent page, meaning it's going to have child pages live beneath it. Anything that has these linked relationships means that there's going to be a menu on this page that gets people into all of these subtopics in a productive way. So you can choose to say, like, maybe one of these pages isn't super relevant. Maybe you don't want to link it in like a sidebar navigation menu or some other kind of like on-page menu. But more often
Hmm.
than not, if it actually like funnels down, you want to make sure that you actually have user paths. And that's what we're trying to represent here. It's like, if you're here, we need to make sure that if you're a user, you can get to all of these pages that are related to the parent topic, because you may think you want to read about custody broadly, and then you actually realize that you really want to read more specifically about mother's rights. And we've introduced that topic here, and
Hmm.
we've linked to it deeper content.
Hmm. And that doesn't mean that that parent page, the child custody lawyer, wouldn't have content on it. It just would have a
Right.
mechanism for a menu of some sort for getting down in it. And that could be a sidebar, that could be a kind of waffle of buttons at the top. It could be a whole host of different ways to do it. But what you're saying is you want to make sure that we are leading down that path in a way that, as you know, they say in the book, that doesn't make the person think very
Right.
much. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I see a lot of people who build their websites quickly. They have what we would call orphan pages of,
Mm-hmm.
if we imagine that like this actually doesn't link, it exists, but it doesn't link. How does that person get there? And when I do website audits and I find these orphan pages, you almost invariably see that they never get traffic.
Right.
It's hard for Google to get to them, and it's hard for users to get to them.
Mm-hmm. They'd have to pretty much search, find it, go directly to it, because there's no other
Correct.
tangent.
Yeah, and even expanding on that point more, they're unlikely to find it in search because Google probably doesn't crawl the page very often because there's
Right.
no path to it. It can only get it through what would either be like the sitemap that's on that may get crawled very infrequently. There's just
Mm-hmm.
no user path. And Google wants to think about the web the way that a user does. That's their whole
Mm-hmm.
game, is they want to try to replicate a user experience.
Okay. Yeah. So this has been, again, like you said earlier, this is beneficial for your, how Google sees your website, but because we're actually
Yep.
trying to be beneficial for your user, for who you're gonna
Yeah.
connect with. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And I think that it is important that even if you're not trying to invest in SEO, which not every firm needs to do that,
Mm-hmm.
it does still make sense to think about this way of planning to make sure that you're not leaving your potential customer high and dry. Like, let's say they hear your name and they're like, "Oh, do they do that thing?" Just make it easy for them.
Right. Right. And so is there you talk about parent page and child pages. Is there kind of a depth that I don't want to go to? Do I want to, can I do, parent pages, child pages, grandchild pages, great grandchild pages?
um, yes, I think that you'll see some websites that will be 4 or 5 layers deep.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Oftentimes those are massive websites. The
Okay.
things like e-commerce websites, for example, that have category upon category until you get to a finished product or a variation of a product. For a law firm's website, it's really hard to imagine the need to go more than 3 layers, which would be
Mm-hmm.
like your homepage is layer one, your parent page is layer two, and then the child page is layer three.
Okay.
It's rare, like that business ownership under high
Mm-hmm.
asset. That's a pretty granular topic.
Mm-hmm.
um it's going beyond that. I can't see a reason why that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the looking at this, I see, you've got divorce, and then we've got a lot of things, a lot of information underneath divorce, and same thing with child custody. We've got a lot of information there. What's the difference between that and my blog? If I'm trying to draw people to this website using my blog, and I'm trying to put a lot of information there, why would I want to put something over on this underneath where my practice area as opposed to
Yep.
underneath the blog?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And sometimes there are some gray areas, but I think the rule of thumb that we think about is if it is related to something that's very static. And so let's say, for example, in this case, divorce law, it's pretty static. And you're going to talk about how you can help someone with a divorce case in a broad way.
Mm-hmm.
That is more evergreen than a lot of what we would recommend to go into a blog post. If it's very static, evergreen content that's unlikely to change, it almost always should be a practice area page or a static page.
Okay.
Blog posts generally are better served for things that are topical or things that are dynamic or maybe very long tail, for example. So this is more of an SEO term,
Mm-hmm.
but it'd be very unlikely to have a blog rank well for something like divorce lawyer,
Okay.
because of the way that websites are built, the way Google crawls things, and the internal linking structure that happens. But it would not be unlikely for a blog to rank for something like, what are the 5 things to think about before getting divorced? So thinking about that, that's a much longer search query.
Mm-hmm.
For us, where would that possibly go on a divorce lawyer page? It'd probably just be a subsection. So having a blog allows us to take what could be a subsection, expand it out, and try to capture search traffic there, where we don't
Okay.
have to get layer upon layer upon layer of, that's where you might get 5 or 6 folders deep in your content structure.
Right.
So when you're getting into that way of thinking, bring it into the blog, and it can just exist 2 layers deep under blog, and you can categorize it and do things in
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can adjust things towards get tags, and people can kind of search within that blog itself,
Yep.
but it doesn't go into, you don't have to create a natural hierarchy
Correct.
in order to make somebody know how to find it. Okay.
Correct. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So hopefully this makes enough sense to somebody who hasn't built one of these out. And I think the big takeaway is that it can be painful for people to do this planning work.
Mm-hmm.
But it is way more painful to not do it and then realize that you've wasted a lot of time and or money in building a site that might need to be reconstructed sooner than you would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I always just encourage people, don't skip over this step when you're building out your site. Have an understanding of how it's going to be done if you're hiring somebody, or, you know, I would even be happy to share a template of this, of how to do it if this was the tool you wanted to use.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of different tools that can get you here. Like I said, you can use Word, you can use, any other kind of diagramming tool. This one just happens to be the one that we've found is the most helpful.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, Jim, I appreciate you kind of diving into this. I know this gets very, very specific, but I think it's stuff like you're saying that lawyers need to be thinking about on the front end. And this is, again, it's kind of a living document, right? I mean, this is not a one and done, I never pick this up again. This helps guide where your website is going in the future, where it might be stuck right now. So I appreciate you sharing this with us.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Zach. I mean, this is a living document. Like, this is something that you can use and continue to add pages to, so
Mm-hmm.
that you can understand. Like, oftentimes people go, did I write something about that already? And if you have something that's searchable like this is,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually just use this as a reference without having to like try to find it on your site. This is a really good, just kind of point of touching base.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a good point, that this is totally living.
Well, and I liken this, you said you can make this into an outline. I liken this to outlining what you're writing. How often does a lawyer sit down and just write a brief or write anything, even a letter? I outline them all the time, so I know where I'm going. I know what I've talked about. I know where I want to talk about. So I think this is great advice to make sure that we're planning these things out on the front end.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me again. And this is, like I said, if anybody wants to talk about the joys of site mapping, we're always available to chat.
Absolutely. And they can find you guys at postali.com. I know y'all are always happy to talk to people. They can get quotes and ideas of what y'all have done previously. So yeah, again, postali.com, and we'll put that in the notes of the video as well. Again, Jim, thanks for being with me.
Cool. Thanks, Zach.